VP or president. Chair, I mean. Anywho, any announcements from anyone about stuff that's not on the agenda? I don't have anything.
I
So-
do. The first announcement is that on January 19th, from 6 to 7:30, there's going to be a Zoom presentation from one of the regional planning commissions in the state of Chittenden on climate change and land use. There's going to be a presentation and discussion hosted by the Wyndham Regional Commission. So I think I sent this around to most of you. I'll resend it, but you can participate by Zoom if you're interested. And then I just wanted to make a quick announcement following up on the downtown parking signage. There is a new highway superintendent. He's been out assessing kind of all the signage and kind of cleaning up some of it right now, and they are still hoping to get to the downtown parking lot signage this winter. So
Oh, excellent.
that's their intent.
Great. Yeah, I saw that there was a multi-retirement in DPW. Good. With new people, there's maybe new short-lived ambition. I just mean that when I was became chair, I felt I was changing everything up, the website and the Google Drive folder, and I've kind of mellowed now after being in it several months or a year and a half.
Good changes, though.
Yep. Thank you.
Change is good.
So, moving on to the minutes.
I move that we approve the minutes from the December 5th meeting.
Great. Is there a second?
Second that.
Gary seconds.
Let's move.
Any discussion about the minutes? Or edits?
Was there another meeting for the bike walk coming up? I guess I wanted to ask that.
There's nothing scheduled right
Okay.
now. The next meeting will be a presentation to the select board. There might be a steering committee meeting before that.
Okay, hearing no comments about the minutes, let's vote. How about we all just put our hands up and say aye? Or sorry, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if that's your honest opinion about the minutes, if not. But that's everyone, that's Sarah and Dan, Gary, myself, Lynn and Todd. Okay. Minutes pass unanimously. Moving on to our bylaw modernization grant with Brandy Saxton of PlaySense. She has a few things to present to us and show us at nearing the culmination of the work.
Hi.
Hi.
Sue, can I get screen sharing capability?
Yeah. Brenda, do you want me to say a couple of words about the timeline?
I think that's a good place to start.
Okay. Brandy's presenting some language that was fixed up from the last meeting and some mapping. Wanted to let you know that she's going to be away and not able to attend the February meetings, but the intent is to get us kind of a full draft of the land use regulations edited in, all the changes we've been making before, in the next couple of weeks, so that we will have that for the February meeting, with the idea of we're going to kind of coalesce around everything, and she'll be with us in March, where hopefully we can put the housing to bed, so to speak, and at least, hopefully be in a position where we can take it to public hearing after that. So that's kind of the timeline with the bylaw modernization work. From our perspective, from staff perspective, we really want to roll in these other amendments because it's just easiest to do it. It's a process to go through the land use regulation adoption. So, I certainly don't want to put forward anything we're not comfortable with, but we do want to make these housing amendments as soon as possible. So that kind of helps accelerate the timeline on the other items that we've been working on as well.
Okay, thank you. Brandy.
Okay, so as Sue said, and is also noted on the agenda, I've got a couple of items to go through with you tonight. I would like to start, I think, by reviewing the mapping, the zoning district mapping, and show you the changes that have been made. We can talk a little bit about the discussions we've been having and how this affects the MDA, because remember, these parts are interrelated. So I'm going to start with that and then move along to talk through the infill housing and the questions about non-residential uses in the residential zoning district third. So that's sort of the order I was thinking of going through these various things. So I'm going to start by getting the mapping up on the screen here. Just give me one moment. Okay, so there you are. You should be seeing a side-by-side map view of, we're starting at West Brattleboro and we'll move along walking through the changes. I decided to put this up so you could see the compare changes. So on the left, of course, we're doing this whole thing over video, so let's hope it's left for you. Where you see the brown shape here along Route 9, that's your currently adopted zoning map. That's the rural business district. And what you see on the right is now orange. That's the neighborhood center. After discussions, which we were beginning to have some discussion of at the last meeting, and I've had more meetings with Sue and the town staff, and we've come up with a slightly reshaped area here and decided that the neighborhood center zone makes sense out here, and it's great. It's a simplification of your regulations because it gets rid of zoning district. It allows for the higher densities of housing and a mix of business types. So it aligns well with this area. So there's been a little bit of reshaping to respond to what's already built and what's being proposed, and then bringing some of the residential in here as well, as we looked at last time. So that's that new shape there. Does anyone have any questions or comments on this piece up in West Brattleboro?
Randy, I'm wondering if you can remind us what the reason is that we no longer would have the potential for commercial along Route 9 in that area?
There are some site complications with the flood zone in here as well. So, and of course, currently the demand is much more for residential. So, the thought is it makes sense to continue this residential area up into here. There aren't businesses on the west side of the road currently. There, and that would still allow for some residential infill. When we get further down here, we do have a mix of businesses on both sides of the road and some higher density housing as well, multi-unit housing, which fits into the neighborhood center zone well.
And the neighborhood center zone does not preclude residential, right? There
Nope.
could be residential? Yep.
Brandy, can you just say a word or two about what may be lost by converting the RB to the NC, besides the, I think we know about like the kind of building aesthetic style?
There is that language. We can look at, because there is some language for districts, we can fold some of that concept in there. But I think the uses will be compatible. I think originally when this district was created, it was to accommodate some of the more highway-oriented businesses that were there, but still try to retain some rural character. I think your vision of this as a neighborhood core, a place that is serving nearby residents, is probably more fitting than the idea that it's a traveler service corridor. And so with that in mind, that neighborhood center district is really crafted for that type of setting, more so than the rural business, which has always been, there's just this one area in town that had this zoning. It was kind of a specific solution at the time to the mix of uses and concerns that were raised about that part of town. So.
Okay.
I was gonna ask you a quick question. Brandy, that particular corridor, only certain commercial and residential, if you go by 7-Eleven and down, that businesses can be established there, but any up towards, say, where Cumberland Farms or Dollar General, is that considered just floodplain in that particular area?
I don't have access to put the flood map on here quickly, but there is a fair amount of flood plain. The depth of the floodplain is actually fairly significant in this area. Obviously it doesn't preclude developing on those lands entirely, but it does make it more complex and costly to do so, which I don't know, Sue, if you had anything further that you wanted to add about sort of the question around, why the change and from your perspective or benefits thereof.
A couple limitations in the rural business. One is the lot size is a lot larger, and so the minimum lot size is larger. There were some housing limitations there to having some different types of housing, and really it was just listening to the planning commission kind of wrestle with the fact of trying to make it more of a place where people could live and get their services, and it seemed like the neighborhood center made a lot of sense that way. There is a lot of flood constraint there, which, could be a barrier to larger housing developments. Not only is the special flood hazard area, but the state's river corridor rule, if it's a lot of units, is gonna come into play. So I don't know that we're gonna see much more housing infill, but definitely the smaller lots and commercial can be elevated.
So if we would designate certain areas non-residential to be built upon, like more.
So the town in the floodway, we don't allow residential at all. You can't build any new residential in the floodway, which, not sure it's really on the Marlborough Road area. I can't remember where the floodway extends to, but definitely along the Whetstone Brook. There is a floodway area. And then, so that's our own regulation. So the state has a river corridor regulation where they're not gonna allow much new, and that comes into play if it's Act 250. And so, that could be a factor in this area.
So one of the reasons for widening this out further along here on Marble Road is we are getting further. The land that comes off of Westgate Drive and Westbrook Court, it gets away from the flood and the river corridor areas. So there's more potential here than there is further down here where you're a lot closer to the Whetstone.
Because it's near that bridge, I guess, where the bridge project was gonna be, because that was that floodplain area where they said where the flooding happened at the other buildings and stuff. Was it more?
The bridge is further down.
Okay, because I
I'm
was
trying to figure out which bridge you're talking about.
Yeah.
There is a bridge that is
West-
kind of a constriction here, but
Yeah.
there's a bridge at the east end of the West Brattleboro Village.
Yes, that's, and there's another one that's set back, too, but yeah, because of that flood area down there.
And Dan has his hand up.
Thanks, Brandy.
Yes, hi everyone. I just wondered if, regardless of whether their zoning has changed essentially, I mean, it seems like everyone in that area in these two differences are changing. Are the property owners being contacted about this?
They haven't at this time. We could do that
Well,
in advance of a public meeting, public hearing. We haven't always done that when we are doing a zoning change. But we are required to be transparent about what we're doing, and give public notice, so.
Yeah, fair
Yeah,
enough. So, if, sorry to interrupt you, but if you were to do that, or I suppose when you do that, or when you respond to someone who attends a meeting, what would be the criteria? Would you highlight the priorities that were given to the changes for each individual lot, or maybe the general differences? Because I'm seeing some are added to the new zone, and some have been subtracted from the old zone. So I'm just curious how you might articulate that.
Yeah, I'd have to give that some thought. It might just be it might be a general notice of the public hearing with some sort of indication that the underlying zoning is changing. It's not a ton of parcels, so we could do a more targeted mailing, letting them know what the proposed change is, and then,
Well,
providing
yeah.
some background on the uses and all that, and then inviting questions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would presume one concern that some of them might have is, or the question they might have is if this is going to change the value or the taxable value of the property, essentially. That's one big one. And
We always send them to the assessors.
And
It's,
the good news is that how your land is zoned actually doesn't affect its taxable value in Vermont for the most part, because the valuation is almost entirely based on what's currently on the property. Possibly the one place where you might see taxation based on the zoning would be if you had something like a business park, that's clearly serviced and has a highest and best use as industrial property. You might see vacant land in there be assessed differently than vacant land elsewhere in town that's sort of assessed at ag and forest value. But, if you're sitting in a zone, as a residential property owner where, you can have one house per acre, and suddenly you become in a zone where you can have one house for every 5 acres. This actually in Vermont doesn't affect your assessed value at all. Because they're under state law, you basically have to assess on what's currently on the property.
fair enough.
Well,
I'm just
that's-
saying that the question might arise that.
Yeah, the question almost always arises.
I've actually never heard a good explanation of that, because we usually send people down to the assessors if
Yeah.
it's a taxing question. But, I would imagine we do like an FAQ, what does this mean?
Mhm.
We could address something like that as well.
Brandy, could you speak to whether there's been any consideration of the space between this neighborhood center and the pink zone below that is West Brat Village? What do we imagine might happen in that space between the two, and is there any rationale for bringing them closer together?
So, my sense and this is a very foggy sense, is that there is a reason that this field was and remains in the rural zone, and I think it's a combination of flood and is it ownership as well? It is
It's
conservation.
conserved.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah,
That-
Vermont Land Trust.
Yeah,
has
which is why
conservation.
there's a hard edge. Yeah, that's why there's a hard edge there that separates those.
And what about coming from the other direction? Is
Up
that
at
a boundary of the historic West Brattleboro Village? Sorry, I meant the pink zone. That's
the pink zone. Oh, okay. Well, we're
Village
gonna
center?
move down
Okay.
to the pink zone when we're done with this one. So maybe we should hold that or see if there's anything else here before we move to the pink zone.
I'll just add, at this point, I'm absolutely in favor of switching to neighborhood center, but I would prefer to see the areas on the west side of Route 9 remain within that neighborhood center designation, because having a one-sided corridor seems a little lopsided, and because the river is not, the parcels that are included are on the riverside, anyhow, I don't find that to be a particularly compelling reason to not allow the neighborhood center to run along that west side of the corridor as well.
Well, I think the one other piece to consider is that the larger undeveloped piece that's in here, there's a definite sense that there's a preference for this to be residential. You might see how the road alignment from Walton Drive down here is actually intended to continue in this direction. And so this piece is going to get put into the NDA with the idea of trying to help facilitate and encourage that residential extension in that direction.
Okay.
But as far as the other lots go, we were in a previous month or two back, you all were proposing to remove those, I don't know, 6 parcels or so because of the limitations of rural business, not allowing residential, multi-unit and such. But now if it's gonna be neighborhood center, that does allow those things as permitted.
Which 6 are you talking about?
Well, just the difference, what's
the ones
lost
that
from
aren't
brown
included.
to orange, besides that one property due to, Lawton Drive. I thought the main reason to remove them was because RB didn't allow permitted residential.
The main reasons to remove them were to get them into the neighborhood development area.
And neighborhood center can't qualify for NDAs?
No, they can.
Oh.
They can. I think my preference would be to not kind of string commercial development along Marlborough Road. It already happens with the kind of 2 shopping plazas down the end. So kind of keeping a little bit more tighter and having the residential surround it would be my preference.
Yeah, I mean, our town
Rather than-
plans and the state statutes and stuff, they do say try not to have strip development and strip commercial, try to have localized compact centers. So, yeah, there's kind of.
Well, were you
I mean,
mentioning?
I probably wouldn't have strung it all the way down the east side if those existing
it is-
uses,
it is
they
what it is
exist,
now.
that's why it's there,
Right.
yeah.
Oh,
I think, weren't you mentioning, I don't know what the last, I don't know, it was during the summer, means with businesses and having residential and commercial on top, in that sense?
Yeah, that is a goal.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's also difficult to finance, and so it's not
Okay.
necessarily happening as much as we'd like to see it.
I'm not sure I see any potential signal to the market that would actually make commercial more viable over RV. From, say, if it was just a 1-for-1 switch from what's now RV to RN, which is what I'm assuming was sort of being discussed by Tom and Lena. I think we've currently been allowing for those things to be proposed, and many of them as permitted uses, and it hasn't happened in the time that we've had this zoned that way. So I don't think that there's too much of a reason to maybe fear that, though I think it is well taken that the RN allows for a level of preferencing residential types in general that is valuable, but it also presumes a particular type of scale that might be difficult for the sort of larger developments that, or larger structures that we might be hoping to see, that the NC would allow for the flexibility of.
It also sounds though like this might not be the area we want to encourage large development to occur. If the area did flood, there'd be more people displaced if it was denser.
The properties on the kind of the south side for it's really kind of the, no, it's the south. Yeah, the areas that we're talking about, there is a little bit of an elevation there, so it's not like it's flat along Marlborough Road.
Right,
It
that's
kind
true.
of,
Yeah.
it is a
Like
little
onto the
steeper
hill a
going
little
up,
bit, yeah.
so, yeah, that's just, something to consider, and the West Brattleboro master plan was really kind of about kind of preserving those more distant views, so. I don't know.
Do you ever do a walk? out there?
Dan's got his hand up again as well.
Okay, hear from Dan.
No, I don't want to interrupt the vibe in the room, but I wanted to ask a question about something a little bit different. If you're going to be changing this, what about, or did you consider the Village Drive? If you could scroll down a bit, Brandy, the Village Drive area. Essentially, why wouldn't we start to expand in that direction?
So that is Mountain Home Mobile Home Park. It's all a planned unit development with a master plan in place to remove some of those units, particularly on the east end, are probably slated for removal. It's floodplain. It's pretty deep floodplain there. We're talking like 8
Understood,
feet below.
Right, understood. But assuming it's going to be redeveloped some way, it would be open to, well, I don't know if it would be more open to more options if it.
It's
That's
not,
a
because
good question.
it's all part of Tri-Parks, and when they move the homes, they're not gonna be able to rebuild there. So not so much portions of Village Drive, they're not moving homes because they're out, or they're less vulnerable, but as you get closer to Edgewood, some of those homes are scheduled to be relocated. And then we were also just using Halliday Brook, the brook there, as kind of the barrier.
As the
Actually, it's the
boundary,
Whetstone,
yeah.
Halliday to the Whetstone as the boundary.
Sure.
Yeah, it's not,
Sure, but are we, I mean, essentially you're trying to encourage residential. Is that correct?
in Village Drive?
In the new neighborhood zone?
I
that
think
you're
what we'd be
proposing?
allowing is larger residential, but also the services to support the neighborhoods that are around there, in the neighborhood center.
Mm-hmm. I'm just asking if, so essentially, well, I guess my question then would be, what zone is Tri-Park? Is it its own
It's
separate?
residential neighborhood, but it's got an underlying planned unit development.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any sense at all to split their land into two different districts. What you see happening on like Brookwood, those are the homes that are slated to be, that's part of Tri-Park, but those will be relocated, and so there won't, it's gonna be conserved land there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the point I was gonna make too. My understanding is that as those homes are removed out of the floodplain, that land gets conserved.
Yeah,
So basically, it functions as flood storage in the future.
yeah.
Dan, do you have a finishing thought? I saw your lips starting to.
No, it's more of a, okay, I suppose that question could come up also. So anticipating that question might be a good idea. But that's just, I'm not sure where people's attention would lie when they're thinking of, you've drawn a line essentially between the Tri-Park and this new zone. Not that you've drawn it, but it is drawn. Yeah, I'm just wondering what that would mean for Tri-Park, if anything.
It's been like this for a long time, and I've done a lot of work with Tri-Park, and I, certainly speak to the new board members. I don't think that's gonna be an issue at all. They're really focused on the, maintaining viability as a park and relocating people to safer areas.
Okay, should we move on to West Brattleboro Village?
I think so.
Look at that one. Okay. So, you see the pink area has gotten reshaped. Some of this is in response to what is happening along Melrose and in the NDA, with the thought that potentially there's opportunity in the future to see a redevelopment of some of the other housing that's here, recognizing that there's also floodplain situations. And I think, Sue, if I'm remembering correctly, there was some interest in perhaps bringing some non-residential uses into the Melrose area as well. So hence the deepening of the village center district there.
Yeah, and I would say in the Melrose area, I mean, several years ago, I'm actually not aware if any of you were on the planning commission. Chris Hart, who was the former executive director, came with the proposal of, would you consider extending the village center to the Melrose Terrace property? With the floodplain restoration that's happened there, eventually they'll be looking to get a letter of map revision to the FEMA flood maps that will take the remaining buildings out of the floodplain, which makes them safer and open for reuse or redevelopment.
And I think the Conservation Committee got involved with that as well also, with regards to that. I sent you some information about possibly expanding the brick buildings.
Yep.
And that's, but now I'm just looking at it, is the one to the R on the screen here right or left that we're looking at right now?
The current
The
one's
smaller
not.
pink area is the currently adopted area, and we're proposing to expand that pink area.
Brandy, could you just speak briefly to that little peninsula added below Academy School? Is that
It's
owned
just
by
to
the
bring
school?
in, it is part of the school's parcel. I don't know if they acquired that land or if just when the map was done last time, it was just cut off at the tree line. I don't actually remember. But now it's just taking in the whole parcel. Yeah. I think is that true, Sue, that matches the designated village center boundary better too, I think.
I don't recall off the top of my head.
I can't remember either, but I'm thinking it might. Yeah. So that's West Brattleboro. We coming down Western Ave. We spent some time looking at this section of Western Ave, just west of the interchange around the William Street intersection. We were considering the possibility, as we were talking about the last meeting, of putting some mixed use in here, and I want to just sort of zoom in and show why in the end we're not recommending that is. And I'm going to actually eliminate the two-screen thing for a minute because they are the same, and just show you kind of what's going on here. So this is the off-ramps here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you've all been up and down the road. And so you know that there's a painted divider that starts here and continues past Brattle Street. So it sort of starts fairly close to where it says Western Ave, that Ave. That distance back from the interchange is controlled by V-Trans they have more control over that in terms of what can happen access-wise and traffic-wise. And after sort of looking at that and thinking about the existing traffic situations, we know from the bike ped plan that this is a major area where improved bike and pedestrian infrastructure is needed as well. The likelihood of being able to get another higher traffic use in here, it's not, the likelihood of getting permits for it aren't good from the state, and the desirability of it from a safety perspective is probably outweighs the benefits of having, something in this immediate area. I think everyone's aware that there is the Country Deli site here and the traffic concerns that were present with that business when it was operating. That kind of traffic concern sort of exists along this whole corridor here. So after discussion, we're thinking that that's not really a good path forward that we'd want to recommend. I'm going to go back to 2 screens there. And look at the Winston Prouty piece.
Hold on just a second, Brady,
Mhm.
before you move on, Dan has his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. I had something to say about that second to last one, but if you could go back to the previous one also, I think we should talk about South Street a little bit. Sorry I didn't catch you before you moved on.
So up in West
Yeah, we're
Brattleboro?
next
Yeah,
to
okay.
Academy School there.
Yep, okay, I found my right South Street.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to presume anything here, but obviously have been some changes in the Delham Chalet area and uphill from Academy School. So in addition to that peninsula piece, I'm just curious if you considered what could go on, what could change there, or if that's not necessary.
So we did bring the residential neighborhood to take in the entire parcel. It did cut off before a little short of the entire parcel, so that residential neighborhood is now for the entire parcel, which makes it eligible for the NDA, and the proposed NDA does take in that site. And Sue, you had in your initial consultation with staff at DHCD, you talked to them a little bit more about building other potential sites here on South Street. At this time, given the lack of sidewalks, it's really not something that they're ready to pursue, or they're gonna, recommend to get an NDA. So we did look a little more broadly around the perimeter of West Brattleboro, but it doesn't seem like any of that area is going to be eligible to get into the NDA, even if we did rezone it to the neighborhood zoning district, the residential neighborhood district. So.
And I think in terms of, more housing on the chalet property, there's other pathways to do that. I think definitely the lack of sidewalks, the topography of South Street, and kind of the historic village core, it's kind of moving on the fringe there.
So when you say eligible for the NDA, those eligibility requirements are things like sidewalks?
Yep.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the NDA around a village center has to be within a quarter mile, so it is appropriate that way, in some sort of plan for kind of pedestrian. They felt that this was, one that they would consider.
So we will be able to get that, or you'll be able to propose to get that piece in, and some of the surroundings, and then like we said, they were open to going in this direction, out towards this direction, and to get in a piece there with the NDA. But for instance, they weren't interested in coming in this direction down here towards Mather Road, or intersects with Bonnieville, in terms of how far out. So, this has got some sidewalk connections going up into the northern part a bit more than it does going out some of those other streets. So that's something that might change over time. You may incrementally grow out there a little bit further if there's more residential development that goes on and more sidewalk get extended.
Well, and I guess what I said earlier about possibly contacting or being prepared to be contacted by the property owners would be, you know, something to be prepared for. The other thing, if you want to go to your next one, the I-91 interchange at exit 2 there, I mean, there is residential right next to I-91 essentially, and you know, I get what you're saying about I think a lot of it has to do with stormwater and everything next to I-91, but are you saying that you're not proposing any changes here because of the proximity to I-91 essentially?
It's a traffic generation question. So from the last planning commission meeting, there was a request to go look at here out on Western Ave and a couple other places around town to see if there were sites where putting a mixed-use zoning district might make sense. This was the one we looked at the most closely, you know, because there is some commercial activity or has been commercial activity along this corridor historically, but, you know, after discussing it around and thinking about it, the traffic generation situation, you know, anything that was going to generate a lot more vehicle traffic in proximity to the interchange is a concern.
You mean more residential specifically?
Well, probably it's more so with the commercial than with residential, which, you know, doesn't quite generate the same amount of constant in and out traffic. You know, I suspect V-Trans might even be concerned with a large enough residential project, right, in terms of numbers of trips to be generated. So, you know, that's something you would have to see what their reaction is going to be. I mean, you obviously have existing homes there, they have existing driveways, you know, that stuff exists. It's the question of if you wanted to do something new.
Yeah.
The existing businesses that are there, were those conditional uses? Were they grandfathered into this zoning district?
They're grandfathered.
They are.
So, this actually gets to my point. I mean, historically, there was a gas station, there were some other things, and, you know, the traffic generation and the impact on the neighbors, you know, we eventually, you know, moved it in a more residential neighborhood way. And so I would imagine if we tried to do mixed use here, I mean, the parking problems at the Vermont Country Deli are real. And constant source of complaints and trying to figure out how to handle them. And, you know, a lot of these lots actually don't have much room for parking, so to think they're not gonna be parking on the street, you know, depending on what the use is. Yeah.
And then with this influx of, like you were saying, there's a traffic studies done up that way also, would be creating more? Or there's something that's gonna happen along with this?
Well, the walk-bike plan looks at this area. You know, that is kind of a key missing link between, you know, Western, the village, and,
Right.
you know,
With the influx and everything, yeah.
so.
Now, could there be a way to write provisions for commercial, such that if they are to be built around this exit, but, you know, beyond the V-Trans purview, that they would have to, you know, build in such a way and such a size and with such a parking lot in order to be allowed? Or that still wouldn't address, you know, the actual just traffic numbers? You know, if we allowed something, you know, but said you can't build like from Country Deli where the parking, you know, is right up against the road, then, and other, you know, provisions, then it could help, you know, address some of those concerns.
Well, I mean, to some extent, the site plan standards
Right.
attempt to do that.
Right.
You know, the fact that Vermont Country Deli is grandfathered means that they're not meeting them.
Yeah, and lots can be combined. I mean, I know we're not necessarily flush with cash and development, but, you know, just because lots are small doesn't mean they can be combined.
Well, piggybacking what Tom was saying, it's like with subways. They weren't grandfathered there, but yet the parking is similar to the way Vermont Country Deli is. If you've been on Putney Road,
Yeah.
it's the same, and I don't know if that was looked into the way that's structured, so is that something that we can add?
Yeah, not right now. I doubt so. Not as part of this project, let's put it that way.
So, I mean, the one other thing I might supplement in here is, we really did take a fairly careful look through the properties that are in this corridor, basically, coming from the park and looking through here. There are a range of physical constraints that, are not perhaps immediately apparent when you look at just the air photo. There's a pretty significant change in elevation on the northern side, and then you've got the whetstone and the floodplain on the southern side. So what you end up with is lots that really aren't very deep, and from a commercial perspective, that's a real problem, because that's where you end up with the parking, not adequate space to get the parking off the road, not adequate space to get the delivery vehicles in and out. You really would want to have a couple 100 feet of depth, and in many cases, you really don't have that along these sites. You've got some, these are part of a condo, ownership situation. That's all land that's not, going to be built on. It's locked up.
And it's steep.
So, there's just, when you actually start to kind of go through it lot by lot and look at it, the opportunities aren't really strong. And since this was an area where the neighborhood kind of reacted pretty strongly in the past to proposed commercial development, it doesn't seem like it's the best potential location for that kind of an effort.
Okay.
Okay, so should I go back here to Winston Prouty? So currently the entire piece is in the institutional zoning district. To get it into the NDA, we need to get it into one of the NDA eligible districts. The idea is to put it into the mixed use district. We talked about that last time. We were sort of thinking we might do the whole parcel. So some more thinking and back and forth with the folks at the state. It's probably too much land to do in one bite, at least. And so the proposal we're thinking about taking to the state is this is the 700-foot contour where you see the split between the orange and the beigey color. We're thinking of splitting the parcel there between the two zoning districts and then using that as the line for the NDA as well. So it would be rural residential further back in and mixed use down here by the road. This also aligns fairly well with their former master plan for the site. So the areas they were thinking for next phases of development are in the orange mixed use area. And then if, that is successful and there's a thought about a long-term further development, you could make adjustments at that time. But at this point, we think it's unlikely we'll get the whole thing, which is about 80 acres in. So this is, probably about half of it. I didn't do the calculation, but roughly about half of it.
Just for my own curiosity, would this change eliminate their PUD?
No.
Oh, okay.
The way our PUD standards are written, that they can still develop within their own PUD. This makes them, they needed to be in a higher density district to be even eligible for the NDA, which this was one of the things, one of the programs the state was kind of encouraging.
Does the first phase of their master plan have proposals for that area where your cursor just was, like that left-rim forest area?
Their master plan's not complete yet.
Oh.
They're working on it now. Former master plans have kind of picked that kind of the area in the corner of Maple Street and as there's a kind of a plateau there for some housing.
Dan?
Just to clarify, so you're saying there's a sort of a cap on the number of acres that, you know, they won't accept a certain large parcel, but they will accept this? What's the criteria there? Is it actually a number, or is it like you don't
Oh, we
wanna
wish.
ask for too much?
We wish there was a number because that would make
Okay.
life easier.
Yeah,
It
I
is a
see.
negotiation
I
process.
see, yeah.
And this is adding 80 acres is for one piece when so much of it is wooded. You know, it's a big ask all at once. The one thing to be said about the NBA program is that other municipalities have had luck with sort of expanding out those boundaries as development expands out. So, you know, if there was to be infill here and then, you know, this area, you know, that's designated got built out and they wanted to continue, you know, it would be possible to come back and get an extension and do the zoning and things like that, but it would sort of be another process. So, reading the tea leaves of the state, we think this is a safer bet than going with an initial ask for the whole thing.
Well, on the other hand, if you were to ask for the whole thing, just as hypothetical, could they then come back and settle on something like this, or and as a contrast to that, if you ask for this, might they cut you back a little bit from this? If
Well,
they
I'm
had-
hoping it's not like the old days where once I went to the downtown board and somebody took a marker to the map during the meeting. I don't like it when that happens. And they don't seem to do that much anymore. So it's really the staff review part, and so that'll be a back and forth discussion that Sue will be having with the folks at DHCD, and they will come to a sense of what will be recommended to the board.
Yeah, and Dan, going for the whole thing, one of my concerns was there is an Act 250 parcel on this property, and I think some of the areas that we took out actually are kind of in the conservation area, like they're not conserved formally, but under the Act 250 permit, you know, there are some, you know, they were kind of identified as kind of conservation areas. So, you know, I think that would trip up in staff review from the state.
Yeah, so A&R does look at these things pretty closely because if it gets into the MDA, then for the development can be exempted from Act 250, provided it meets certain criteria. So the priority housing type of development can be exempted. So they're fairly protective of their prior Act 250 decisions.
I just want to go back to Tom's question about the master plan, because, you know, everything I've heard about the master plan that they're working on is really infill on the existing campus. So I don't know that it would include that Maple Street corner, but it's not done. So to that extent, it could be drawn even, you know, could be closer.
Yeah, I mean, because that northwestern part is all forested, it's not watered and sewered, it's not developed, so. But if the state's willing to grant it, then I guess we can entertain that thought.
Okay, so that's the substantial changes. The one thing you can see here just by zooming out, and so you see them side by side, is you do see that residential, the brighter yellow. I think we looked at that. There hasn't been any further changes to that boundary, but it gives you a chance to sort of see it in context to see what has changed here on the map. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing mapping. And turn my attention to the infill, the update to the infill housing. So I'm going to walk and include a memo that walk through the changes Some of it was just consolidation and simplification as we kind of thought through the approach a little further. Some of the adjustments that you guys talked about at earlier meetings, particularly around building height, are in here. So maybe the best way to do this is to first let you ask any questions that you have, and then if we don't hit the highlights, I'll hit a couple of other points I want to make sure that you've taken note of. But were there questions or comments specific to the infill housing piece? Okay, not hearing any. Okay, so why don't I run through a little bit the further refinements to this. One was sort of a realization that the approach before had a lot of complexity around how the property was being accessed from the front or the back, and how that affected the dimensional standards. And we had a little bit more conversation about access during prior meetings. So I've tried to simplify that a little bit. So some flexibility has been built in here. You can, a property owner could add an additional driveway to serve infill housing. There's some properties that we've looked at, you know, like when we went out on the tour and such, where, you know, some of them had frontage on more than one street, where you might want to put buildings in and come at them from the other street, or you know, the existing driveway might go to a garage, and you might want another driveway that sort of goes into the back of the property. So there's some possibilities here of getting a second driveway in to serve new housing. There's a simplification of the driveway standards, so a 10-foot wide, a minimum driveway that's, as long as it's not more than 300 feet, which in these areas should not be an issue. And then the only other of the design and construction standards that stay in place relate to how the driveway interacts with the sidewalk. So we still want sidewalks going over the driveway entrances. And then we want sidewalks removed to put in the driveway, and making sure the culverting and stormwater is all working okay for the driveways as well. So those are obviously two important points that we don't want to eliminate altogether, but some of the other more complicated elements of new driveway design have been simplified out here, with the assumption that these are going to be relatively short driveways. There's also the ability to serve the multi-unit buildings from these driveways. So that's there. And then with that simplification to the driveway language, sort of consolidated down the table and grid that we were using, so there's no longer sort of examples of how to do this with access from the front and how to do it from access from the back, and standards there. So we just simplified that and made a provision for the width of the driveway. So there's a minimum lot width, and then at least 12 feet to accommodate a driveway. If you have two driveways, you need to have that minimum lot width plus 24. You can see how that would work, so that does deal with the size of the lots. That addresses the driveway component. Around building height, a couple of things have been done. First, there's been clarification that a parking level wouldn't count as a story for the purposes of determining the building height. If you did have a site that lent itself to putting parking under the building, that would be not taking away from the total height that you could have. And there is language in here for dealing with a definition for full story, and then these building heights are measured in full stories. So something like a walkout basement doesn't count towards a story, or sort of a half story up under the roof doesn't count as a full story. So we're really counting. So there's some possibility to get some extra space depending on the characteristics of your building and your site. And then there is also, I did go to the apartment types, both the courtyard apartment and the mansion style apartment, and did do those to 3 stories. So those are also 3 stories in addition to the stacked triplexes and townhouses and such. So those can go upwards.
Dan's hand is up.
Yes.
Brandy, thanks for that. Just to get in sort of the combination of the driveway and the potential for parking on that first level, is there so the height of the total building comes from essentially grade level. Is there any provision in there for adjusting the existing grade, or is there any concern about that? Like, for example, you need to put in drainage if you were going downhill from the sidewalk here, you know what I mean? If the driveway were going down, is there anything, do you need to write that in at all, or is that just going to be by case kind of thing?
This is a good question. I'm thinking. Just trying to remember what we exempted landscaping. So you're not exempted out of the stormwater.
Well, sure,
So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
No, you'd have to
there
put
is
extra
some
drainage
consideration.
on that,
Yeah,
or
there is
stormwater
consideration of dealing with the stormwater. And if you remember, that section of the regulations does, it encourages for small things like, and for residential and smaller projects that it be green stormwater. So it's basically looking to, direct the stormwater to a place where it can infiltrate the green space where it can infiltrate. So, that obviously is anyone building anything in Brattleboro has that as a consideration to deal with the stormwater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my sense is that some of the lots that might come up haven't been developed because of ledge or because of other slope issues, and so that's why I ask. There would be the existing grade, and then the proposed grade might be lower, right? So, yeah, I didn't know if you had to put anything.
That is actually a point to keep in mind. I think we've kind of made that a little bit too when we were out on the walks, is that the land that hasn't been built on does tend to have challenges. And may take some creativity and different approaches to if it's going to be built on. So those are definitely things to probably keep an eye on going forward as well.
Yeah, and I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but along with that, I mean, the major development impediment would be, the blasting through ledge, for example, to put in the sewer line and so forth, and that's I'm hoping that's something that this can. That sounds like a great innovation where you can, let's say, put the parking underneath the building, rather than blasting down. There might be some way to creatively develop some of those lots.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever driven, and I always have trouble. I think it's Route 14 coming out of White River Junction, heading towards. I don't even actually know what the next thing is after that. That's really bad of me. I drive this fairly frequently, and I don't know what the town. So you go out through West Hartford and such. at one point, someone built, a series of 3 or 4, projects out there, and they used, the Vermont units to do them. One of the examples they did, I think they were somewhat demonstration projects, or they may have been rejects from the Vermont factory or something, and a local contractor put them in. I'm not quite sure what their provenance is, but they all appeared out there. And so there's one where they put 3, I think, in a row, and they put them on piers. Probably because there's some floodplain issues, but they also then put the parking underneath them, which was actually a kind of an interesting solution. And you could see something like that on an uneven, they're just sort of sitting in an open field, but you could see something like that on uneven ground as well, right, where you might, build out from some elevation and have
Up here, yeah.
underneath it. Yeah, and they're just on concrete,
Yeah.
cylinder piers. They're actually, and they've got a nice decking system around them. They're actually quite fun. Interesting to see. I think I may have a photo of them somewhere, but yeah. So that type of construction might be possible on some of those more difficult terrain situations. If you sort of think about ways to build to the slope and with the slope differently.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah, I was thinking about when we were looking at parking, like there's a lot of those garages like, we have on Canal, where if there's issue with parking, is there a way to get parking allocated in certain lots where people can do off-street parking if they don't have it set up in those type of garages?
That, Sue, feel free to jump in, but my understanding is that is possible in Brattleboro, that you do sell permits for parking in certain of the municipal facilities.
I think
And
sorry, Brandy, go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was going to say, we've written this so that the parking can be, up to 1,300 feet, I think.
Mhm.
So some distance away. It could be off-street, it could be private parking or public parking.
Yeah, I think we need to, what he's talking about in your neighborhood is more of a private lot that's
Right.
just parking. And I feel like there's some barrier in the regs to that, so that might be something we need to check in,
Okay.
because the idea is we didn't want all these just parking lots in the residential
Mhm.
neighborhood areas.
Right.
So
And
we
I
might
was
need to
looking
check
at
in on
that
that.
too, because that way it keeps cars off the street, you have your streets clear for biking and all that, and cleaning. So if you have these little private garages that people can rent people out that they do now, you could have your car parked in it whatever amount of time. I don't know if we did that area, walk down that area where Canal Street, where Tom, where your area's at, they have these little garages that
There's
are.
actually one right behind us.
Yeah, oh,
here.
yeah, perfect.
Bird
And
Street.
I was just maybe suggesting maybe that might be an option or something we can foresee. and look
I will
into.
flag that to kind of look in the existing regs, but I feel like there might be some barrier to just creating a parking lot in a residential neighborhood.
Yeah, I think as a primary use is the problem.
Mm.
If you were, if you had a building and had parking and you wanted to supply extra parking for a neighboring property owner, I think that would be possible, but it might be a problem if the only thing on the lot is a parking facility.
I don't think that use is listed in the RN. It is listed variously as a permitted or conditional use in some of our districts.
Yeah,
As is structured parking, but I don't think we list it at all in the RN.
yeah, maybe looking at it as a conditional use, maybe.
Yeah, I think that would
Could
be,
be. We'll look at that.
thinking about where the property lines are, 20 stalls of parking on their own small plot is the same thing as 20 stalls of parking attached to the lot that a house or a apartment block is on.
Mm.
From bird's eye view when you can't see the lines.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see any reason why that couldn't be a creative way to do it.
Yeah, we see a few of those where we went on a walk up by South Main Street, I think it's up by Central Street. Up in that, there was some extended garages, and people could park in those particular garages or rent them out too.
Brandy, there's two areas I'm wondering if you could speak to, because I think the planning commission, I just want to point it out to them. One is the minimum unit size, and I don't recall having seen that in an earlier version. And
Right.
then the minimum yard area, if you could
Yep.
explain those.
So, I did add the minimum unit size. I actually thought this would be helpful to property owners who might be trying to figure out what they could feasibly do and get onto their property. Those numbers are low. I don't envision that you're going to run into problems with, they're not tiny house numbers, but they are certainly at the low end of where unit numbers are often set for multi-unit buildings. So I think in terms of fitting into the fabric of the residential neighborhood, these would be small residential units in those neighborhoods. But I think it could actually be helpful to someone, if you're thinking about this kind of as a guidebook as much as a set of regulations, to somebody who's trying to figure out, could they get more housing on their lot? This gives them some sense of what they should be planning for, and they could definitely plan for larger if they wanted larger. But this gives you kind of a realistic sense of what you can do. Say if you had a existing larger building and you were thinking about breaking it up, what kind of yield might you reasonably get out of that? So that was the thought around the minimum unit size.
Randy, where did the
And then there's, yes?
sorry, I was just curious where the 430 square feet plus 100 per bedroom came from?
So if you look at the unit widths, that's where some of the math originated from, thinking about sort of a likely unit component. So sort of thinking of the module in a way, like what's the smallest module? We're saying smallest unit width is 18 feet. There's 20s and 24s, I think, as well. There's 18s. Yeah, 18s, 20s, and 24s. And so that is where the math originally came from. And then in terms of a bedroom size, from a code perspective, they think you need to have 80 square feet, plus you're going to need some space to, eventually hallway space, type access space. So that's where the 100 originates out of. I looked at a bunch of examples from various, places that do more building code type work. Oftentimes the minimum is closer to 500 or 600, which there's been complaints that minimums are too high. The other thing that's really interesting is if you see this increment happen. So you'll see sort of a certain minimum size for studios, 1 and 2 bedrooms, and then there's a bigger chunk, a bigger increment, like they're going up by 100, right? Because you're adding bedrooms, and then there's a bigger chunk. Apparently, by the time you get to the 3rd bedroom, there's been a decision that you have to have 2 bathrooms. So you end up seeing a bigger increment go up. When you hit the 3rd bedroom with the idea that there's going to be a 2nd bathroom, or at least a half bath and a full bath.
I would be interested in seeing, because the tiny house appendix that was added to the International Residential Code specifies 400 square feet. So I'd be curious about going down to 400 square feet as the minimum to be in alignment with that set of regulations, because they do then have additional allowances if a municipality chooses to adopt it and to use it, with some modifications for stairs and lofts and that sort of thing. So bringing it to 400 would potentially align with the tiny house appendix that's part of the International Residential Code.
Randy, question?
I think Dan had his hand up.
Oh, it's not up now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You,
Lena addressed the question, thank you.
Ah, there you go.
so for the number of units requiring minors project site plan review, 3 or above, and I think 1 and 2 is exempt from site plan in our current regs, so that's why you have that written there. And my question is, does that mean the total units per lot, or what if 1 year 3 units is built and then a few years later another 3 units is built detached from it? Is that a 6-unit project, or is that 2 3-unit projects? You know, if there's a 2-unit project and then a 2-unit, that would have been a better example.
So, if you are building a single unit, or you're building a duplex, or you're building an accessory unit to a single unit, those are automatically by statute exempted. Even if you were to build multiple of them on a property, if your zoning allowed for that, they still wouldn't be subject to site plan review. So it's the number of units in the building. So the minute you go to build the 3-unit building, that one is subject to site plan review, or the 4-unit. So it's the actual building itself.
It's not the end total after a project. Okay.
So it, you know.
I'm sorry, could you just clarify, Brandy, was it, so now the trigger is 3 units, or is it 4 units?
The trigger currently is 3 units. It would remain, so 1 and 2 are exempt by statute from site plan review. And this would allow, I think right now you have, if you're building a new building, it's not a minor, it's a major, and so that goes to the DRB. And the minors are dealt with by the zoning administrator. So this would allow anyone that's coming through and meeting these missing middle standards to stay not in front, they don't have to go to the DRB. They don't end up needing a hearing. So they stay in administrative approval. That's one of the main benefits, actually, of this option, is that it provides a simplified permitting process.
So is the intent there to, I mean, one side effect of that might be to discourage a third, like if you have a 2-unit, would it discourage the 3rd unit being added? I really haven't thought that through, but, or, you know, if it were 3, then you have to go to, you're not exempt. But if we made it, or if it could be made 4, then we might encourage more 3rd units being built, or no?
I don't think the site plan review is a big barrier, particularly if you make it administrative. It's not going to be that expensive. It's not going to take that long, so it's not going to be a barrier. It's really an opportunity to make sure that to get a check-in on projects that, you know, are going to have other potential impacts. You know, they may need other permitting. It's a good check-in for the zoning administrator to sort of keep a knowledge of what's there, what's going on. But we've exempted out many of the standards for new multi-unit. So those things, the things that are coming through this missing middle option won't need to meet those requirements for multi-unit buildings. And so if, you know, the site plan review, I don't know what you're charging these days to for administrative site plan review, but I don't think it's a significant, you know, it would, I can't see that being the reason somebody would be like, well, I'm not adding a 3rd unit now.
Because either way, you're submitting permits. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a little bit more.
Okay, and then the green space one, there was discussion before about sort of the overall lot area, and what was the overall lot area going to be, that, you know, with this housing on it, you know, what happens to, is there a requirement for yard space, the, you know, lot coverage standards, things like that. So going along with the idea of having some minimum indication for unit size, added in some minimum open space requirements too, and that number also came with sort of thinking through, if you were to actually build new, following these rules, you'd be looking at, like I said, these units are 18 to 24 feet at their minimum, and they have to be 10 feet back. So if you do that math, you end up having roughly 200 square feet of green space already right there. So for someone trying to sort of think through what they can fit on their property, it may be a useful guide.
And what's the reason to do that rather than a lot coverage minimum? Or a lot coverage maximum, rather?
So we've basically replaced out the dimensional requirements of the base zoning district with these, and we did carry the lot coverage through. So there is the possibility of getting a higher lot coverage than you could in the underlying zoning district. But, I think in these neighborhoods, there are some blocks in Brattleboro where, there's relatively little green space and a really high lot coverage, but most of the residential areas where you're likely to see these projects go, green space is part of the overall form and fabric of the neighborhood, and I think you want to maintain some amount of green space. We just talked about the stormwater, for example. That's going to need some green space. Having outdoor space for residents is certainly part of quality of life for those residents as well. So I think there's good reasons to have some, to not let it go to, complete build out at 100%. This is just a small amount of open space that goes along with each unit.
Is there a requirement that units have access to that, or is it more about green space than amenity for units?
There is not that requirement for actual green space, recreation outdoor use area is in the multi-unit residential standards that this is exempted from.
Okay.
So that piece is not actually here. So other thoughts, questions on the infill? Okay. Hearing none, we've got, I know, I'm keeping my eye on the time, so I know you have some other things you want to spend a little bit of time on tonight as well. So I put together a memo for you guys to sort of talk a bit about the mixed use district. Like I said, we did go, we looked at the map. Looking for, I guess what I would ask you to think about, and maybe this is a good task for February, is to think through what exactly are the uses that you think would be desirable or beneficial in areas that, in neighborhood areas. So, those neighborhood serving uses, what exactly are you thinking about? And try to define that a little more. I think if that was a little better defined, then figuring out what the best regulatory mechanisms to solve that problem, it might be a little bit easier. I think I'm not completely convinced that expanding mixed use is the best solution to that. I did run through in the memo and outlined what's currently allowed for non-residential uses in that residential neighborhood zone. Obviously, one of the options to consider is to adjust that, to make some modifications, add some more things if you want to adjust the locations or size of what's allowed. But I think thinking through and having some time to discuss what it is you're trying to allow for, or you think that would be a positive addition to these neighborhoods would be good to do. And then, you know, it's one of the, there's a couple of things to think about, you know, the location in terms of traffic. We had that conversation about Western Ave, you know, where the, you know, some business uses might occur. You know, if it's on a busy street, that's one thing. If it's on, you know, a street that's really quiet, you know, it might have a different level of acceptance from the surrounding neighbors. And size doesn't necessarily equate to traffic either, which is always one to sort of make it a little trickier. So I think in my memo, I gave the example that you could have a, you know, really tiny little footprint of a pizza shop and generate a lot of traffic from a very small space. You know, whereas you could have a fairly expensive, you know, accountant's office and not get too many people coming and going all day long. So thinking through that idea of what are these services, assumably is kind of the service uses that you're interested in, and allowing for where, what kinds of businesses are you envisioning?
Yeah, Brandy, Lynna and I met a few days ago with staff, and we tried to hem out some of these ideas. We didn't, you know, come to anywhere close to a final draft. But before maybe I go into some things that for uses that I think we came up with then, I have a question. When I looked at home business, the standards for that earlier, I don't think it spoke to, one thing I'm still confused about is what does it speak to for public visits?
It does allow.
It does allow it. So a home business could be a shop or a food service restaurant or a bar.
It could, it could have signage that those businesses would typically want to have.
Right.
So they would have to really rely on word of mouth.
And they'd have limited hours too, most likely.
There's hour limitations, there's
Right.
employee limitations,
Sure.
and we were just looking at this.
Right.
but-
Yeah, I was just unclear about the public.
Traffic and delivery.
Yeah.
There are some, you can have more customers coming, but it's not intended to be kind of
Right,
a
because
high
of kind of
intensity pizza shop or something like
the kind of other restrictions.
I think they're all reviewed as conditional use regardless as
Yeah.
well, so that aspect, if a bar were to come up, it would be reviewed by the DRB as a conditional use, so
Mhm.
it's not like there's a loophole there per se.
Right.
So, you know, with the home occupation or a home business, what you're thinking about is that from the outside, you want it to generally continue to appear as a residence and to not have impacts like traffic that are significantly different from surrounding residences, which doesn't mean that there has to be no deliveries or no customers, but if there's, you know, significant amount of trucking traffic or a lot of customers in and out, then you clearly are no longer, you know, maintaining that residential character. It's always a bit of a challenge with the home business and home occupation. We deal with these, and building administrators deal with this quite a bit, because, you know, businesses often start off fairly small in these type, and then if they're successful, they grow, and they may slide slowly towards not really fitting into a residential setting anymore. And so that's always an ongoing challenge with that home business, home occupation language. If there is some interpretation that has to happen as to whether the intensity of the business activity has exceeded what is typical of the surrounding neighborhood and change the residential character of the property.
Yeah, I think one challenge that we had in that work group and thinking about it later was just all these nuances between home occupation, home business, accessory commercial unit, and, you know, an actual principal use that would be allowed in a district. But some of the uses I think that we talked about as, you know, that we think could benefit a residential neighborhood could be, we've already talked a little bit about, within limitations, right? But a bar, a food services place like a restaurant, perhaps an art gallery, small performance theater, and then the miscellaneous manufacturing is classified as like small scale hobby sort of craftsperson style. So those are just in pet and animal services too, you mentioned.
Not kennels.
But not kennels, yeah. But there was other things in the list too. Yeah, it's difficult because if we allow some of these things as just permitted principal uses, then that can displace housing. And if we allow it as home business, then that comes with significant limitations. So I guess I just say that to say that it seems like, at least my understanding of how we may shape accessory commercial use, to be somewhere in the middle between those two, seems to allow the residential to still be the primary and not get kind of pushed out or watered down. But I guess it could water down the accessory dwelling unit potential of the lot. But it allows for more kind of complexity and diversity and servicing of those neighborhoods, and hopefully making them more attractive, at least in most people's minds.
I mean, I think the one other thing to maybe add into the mix of factors that you're considering is proximity to existing commercial areas, both from the point of view of, do you want to be undermining their ability to attract tenants and businesses to those locations, and then sort of inversely, like, is it going to be economically viable for someone to have a small business in this location that might be competing with, existing businesses that are close by downtown or on, Putney Road or Canal Street or whatever. So I think thinking about that from both directions. So I think location could be something to think about, and maybe thinking and looking at your map a little bit, thinking about the sort of pedestrian, the walking shed, right? Where are there neighborhoods that are poorly serviced now? That could be an approach to help you narrow that down. One of the reasons to limit the commercial activity in residential areas is to try to ensure the ability of the areas where things like Main Street areas, right? If you're allowing stores to go everywhere, then you're opening up a lot more potential locations where people could base themselves, and in some ways, there's a kind of carrying capacity that the community of a certain population has for retail and service uses, and so you want to think a little bit about how you're going to meet that demand. Certainly, the idea of having basic services that are walkable to neighborhoods is an attractive idea. So sort of trying to figure out where there are neighborhoods that are underserved could be a good start.
Thank you for thinking about this and producing this memo. It doesn't strike me as being applicable very much to the Bylaw Modernization Grant and housing, but I know that we're working on it, ACUs and whatnot, and so it seems related enough, so thank you for spending a little time on this. Is there any other thoughts from commissioners about this memo or the topics?
Not yet. Work in progress.
Okay, I think that ends Brandy's time on the agenda and presentation. Any final words or?
No, I will look forward to seeing you again in March and hopefully getting the project wrapped up and over the finish line.
I think those were good final words.
That's great.
Okay,
Thank you, Brandy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
have a good night, bye-bye.
Okay, we spoke a little bit about this at a previous meeting, but chose a different path, and then due to time constraints and, you know, the state duplicating that, the project we had planned, here it is again. Now we're freed up to consider the Better Connections grant. And staff has prepared a little something about that.
Tom, before we move on entirely,
Sure.
how do the things that we discussed now with Brandy actually get decided?
Yeah, well, right, it's kind of, the crux of it is going to be a land use regs revision or amendments, plus the NDA applications, so that there's going to be a meeting where we just say at some point like, hey, we are ready to put this to public hearing. Not the application, we'll just send that off, right?
Yeah.
But then a public hearing will be warned, and, you know, we'll preside over that, and the public will be invited, and staff will probably make a great presentation, mainly, you know, with PowerPoint slides and whatnot. And then based on the public comments, or just our own thinking of seeing it another time, we can make more changes if we want before then, or we can axe it, I guess. But more changes before sending it to the select board, and they do that same thing twice. And at the second time, they finalize it. Is that it, more or less, Sue?
Yep. And more immediately, I mean, Brandy's gonna give us the final language based on the input that was given tonight and kind of the things that she presented. I mean, if there was something that was so egregious, it's always good to speak up. You know, we'll have that for the February meeting to kind of figure out, you know, what are the other tweaks that we'll need. And
So we'll have the opportunity then to review as the planning commission at the next meeting. Then it will be prepared by staff and presented at public hearing.
Yeah, well, I think we'll have the February meeting
Mhm.
without Brandy.
Mhm.
She'll be back in March to kind
Okay.
of
Okay.
wrap it up. So I think
Great.
February is gonna be important to really, if there's thoughts or reactions that haven't been expressed at these
Mhm.
meetings, then I think, you know, maybe we can come to some consensus in February. We want this, we don't want that.
Right. And will she have the NDA application for us to see too?
I think she's actually gonna have some of that to me beforehand, yeah, and then I'll
Okay.
be having conversations
So we're
with
gonna
the
have
state.
a finalish draft of her work, and it's our last sort of chance to edit it.
So I'm also thinking too, before March Madness begins for RTM, I was just thinking, if we have it, I guess, prior before, I mean, this cap, because it's gonna be a lot of articles, as we know. And with that being said, is there a time and date for that, basically? We don't know yet.
No.
Okay.
No, there's some, you know, if everything goes well in March, then I would imagine it'll be the beginning of April. I'm
Right.
not gonna try to run public hearings in the middle of RTM and
Right.
RTM extra
And then
meeting.
January is also election for select board.
It's gonna be way before.
Thank you, I appreciate the clarification.
So anyway, so what we've been thinking about for a Better Connections grant proposal is kind of a Safe Streets corridor plan for Canal Street. It is coming out of the walk bike plan, which is not finalized yet, but it's been identified as, it's got no bike lanes, it's got some difficult intersections for pedestrians and bicyclists to maneuver, as well as vehicles. So kind of drilling down on that, the level of the walk bike master plan isn't specific enough, and it is calling out the need for further study of that corridor. And so, yeah, it's basically, you know, considering the bike lanes, considering change in that corridor, land use change that might occur. There are some, you know, underutilized parcels that in the office we're often looking at as, it'd be great to have some infill housing here and here. So if we take into account those kind of visions, work on kind of a conceptual plan of how can we accommodate bicycle lanes. And I also want to work on improving the transit amenities in that area. So there's a real lack of bus shelters, even bus signage, you know, appropriate maps of the routes and that kind of things that I think Southeast Vermont Transit is interested in seeing improved as well, not just in Brattleboro, but in the entire area. Don't think they're gonna be able to fund it on their own, so if we can do some of that planning with them, I think that will be helpful. Ideally, I'd like to get this down all the way to the bike ped bridges. So, you know, it'll come down Bridge Street, this is my idea for this plan. And, you know, encounter some of, what will we see down there when the bridge changes to the bike ped bridges. We've talked about having a Wooner on Bridge Street where it's primarily designed for bikes and pedestrians. Maybe we can get a little further in that design and kind of get some buy-in from the community on that.
I guess my question is like, getting it, if you're going down Canal, you have the museum and that big wall, it's gonna be a lot. Questions and all that, and was looking at the information about the bridge project, I think it was 4 months ago, I was just in the NPR. Do you see it anytime, I guess, after this is done, getting on that? Because I'm quite sure what stage where they're at right now with bridge completion, of having that particular walkway where they have they'll keep the old bridge and
Yeah.
utilize that. I believe they're gonna probably fix that up a little, if I'm not mistaken.
I think the state of New Hampshire's looking for that money.
Okay,
to
so just
fix
having an
those
idea,
bridges.
what was it, the Albany, I think Hinsdale, what was it, that was their regional commission?
Southwest Regional.
Would they be invited to this as well, to get some thoughts?
Probably not, because
Okay.
we wouldn't actually go onto the island.
Right, okay.
And, you know, we've seen those kind of visions for the
Yeah.
island, which are cool.
I mean, you could just look on their site and see where they're, okay.
Yeah.
But as far as with the Amtrak, also that would be what we spoke about this summer, and all that.
Yep. So that's the idea for this plan. By the end of the month, I would need to kind of have a pre-conference with the state, and then the grant application is due February 17th. So I have a bunch to do in the next couple of weeks. I'm trying to put together a scope of work, trying to find a match for the town's matched portion of this, which isn't too excessive. And then eventually, there is a resolution that the planning commission would have to sign off on, so I would bring this back before the planning commission for the February 3rd, and then eventually take it to the select board for their approval to apply for the grant.
Now, is there any ARPA money for that as well? Is there anything left, or is there anything that's still there for this type of project too?
For
As far as
ARPA,
infrastructure, yeah.
the town hasn't designated where
Ah.
the ARPA funds they've
Just
received.
the way, okay.
That's a select board decision.
Dan's hand is up.
Yeah, great, thanks. Sue, could you also address the southern extreme end of canal that you're considering? Are we stopping at I-91, or are we going all the way to the town line, or?
No, that's a good question. I was thinking of it actually to Fairground. It could go to exit 1. I don't, you know,
Well,
yeah, I know where you're going. I think I
I
mentioned.
think you know where I'm going with this, but, well, okay, that's fine. I mean, we can talk about that more. So the other complication I was wondering about is the state highway designation. It's Coolidge Highway, Route 5. Is there any complication due to that?
So extending it past, but you know, it's worth a conversation with V-Trans to see what they would think. It's their roadway, and I'm sure they'd be happy to let us do some work at our expense. They often are, if they've signed off on it, but I don't know that I don't know that that's in the best interest of the town to necessarily fund stuff. But I'll have a conversation. I think taking it past, you know, could make sense, at least even, you know, to the town line, or at least to some of the large industrial parks that are there. I would imagine that's primarily gonna be bicycle lanes or something like that, but it is a little funny once we start working on the town. So part of Route 5 is town maintained, even though it's state owned, and so I'm, you know, usually comfortable we're working in that area. But once you get onto this state owned, state maintained, then it's a little tricky, but that's a good conversation to have with them and to see if we can't expand the area. We would get priority points by, having it in our neighborhood development area, which goes up to exit 1. So,
All the way to the exit.
all the way to the exit, yeah.
I mean, as you probably, you're all guessing, I would encourage you to go as far as you can, but
Yeah.
at least through the interstate intersection, like possibly to the industrial park. That would be, that'd be great, because there are already sidewalks, there's all kinds of issues to be addressed there alone, so it may add a whole bunch of dimensions that you don't want to deal with. I get that too, but, yeah.
I appreciate it. It's a good suggestion.
Randy, is there anything else besides our input at the February meeting that you need or want from us to move this forward?
Not right now that I can think of, but I have to get into the grant application.
Okay.
So Sue, I was wondering too, and I don't know how the rest of the board feels about this, commissioners. Is this something that you want to do as a subcommittee to brainstorm and PowerPoint, get suggestions prior before that? Because I have a lot of ideas. With time constraint, we're not going to have time. Or would you rather just have it emailed to you or just, I don't, Tom's great with subcommittees.
Are you talking about for this grant?
Yeah, I mean, not just forget, but thoughts on what ideas we have also, like we were discussing with Dan. And, and we were all discussing what thoughts of how we see, what we would think and like to see. I think we discussed this in the summer too, partial of that, but it was to be continued. But I had some other thoughts, but I said, well, due to time, maybe we can.
I would say, if it's something to like the scope of a proposal, that would be good. If it's something specific for an intersection, that's like way too detailed at this point.
Right.
But like something like Dan's comment about the, the study area, something broad like that,
Mhm.
please send it to me.
Okay. Because like I know there's, I don't know, proposed roundabout there, and so many other different things that are being proposed for that, and just trying to get an idea visually how that would look when we put that together as far as with,
I would-
signage and bikes and lights and all
Yeah, I mean,
that.
I think that would come if
Yeah.
we get the grant.
And I'm hoping, but, I guess this, if that we do, and I hope we do, we can put that into a memo to present to you or something like that,
Yeah.
just throw it your way.
You can
and
just send me the email.
Yeah, that'd be great, that way we can figure out something too with that.
On that note, Sue, could you tell us, I'm not sure if I missed this already, but when this is due, when this application is due?
Yeah, so I have to submit a kind of a pre-proposal by January 31st, and then the actual grant would be due February 17th. But I'm gonna have to do a lot for the pre-proposal, because it's a pretty quick turnaround after that.
Right, so we might have some time, Gary, to review it, but it's a tight
Yeah.
timeframe.
Yes.
I mean, something specific that's realistic and obtainable, that's gonna be pretty much what we all can say, okay, this is something that could happen.
But I don't want specifics of like, it'd be great to have a roundabout at Fairground, and,
Right.
it's more like I said, the study area, what might be included in the study. So I talked about transit, I talked about intersections, bike lanes, maybe signage.
Yeah.
If you're thinking large, looking at some land use changes on
Like
parcels.
shrubs and trees and other. places people
Streetscaping,
can sit.
yeah.
Simple things like the aesthetics that basically we would have and most places have at their municipal centers or downtown and stuff like that. So when they're coming in and over, walking and taking those bike lanes, and, I would think, Tom could put together a Google Doc, people could just throw it in there.
I don't think it's needed for
Okay.
the grant proposal.
Gotcha, okay, until that grant.
If we
And
get
then
the
we can-
grant, then we'll.
Yeah, if I can make another suggestion, Sue, it might simplify it if you send us a link. I remember seeing this before, to the Better Connections grant.
Sure.
Just that piece, that would give kind of a
Yeah.
idea of what we're up against. It's not a guarantee, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so if people have more ideas that come to them about the scope of the project, please send them to Sue, and then we'll get the final, or we'll get a version to look at the February meeting before they send it off and before the February 7th deadline. You don't need a vote at this point, right? It's
No,
just
as long
general
as there's
agreement to
like
go
a
ahead with it.
consent
Consensus,
going on, like
right.
a,
Okay.
and you're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
So here we are at 7:50. I would like us to continue a bit beyond 8 to hopefully, start making some progress on the ACUs and the energy criteria topics. But I think it's going to take a vote, as our bylaws say, of at least 4 of us, 4 of the 7, to move beyond 8 o'clock. To a time certain, but not later than 8:30 is what the bylaws say. So we could say 8:30 and then just try to not go that long, but I'll make that motion that we continue until 8:30 or earlier if we decide to finish.
Oh, second.
And Todd seconds, great. And all those in favor, please raise your hands and I'll just look around. That's everyone here, and Dan and Deb.
Dan's giving you.
Okay, thanks everyone, great. So we'll just go into the ACUs. We talked about that a little bit with Brandy here, and I mentioned that Lynn and I met with staff several days ago, I think, to try to flesh out some of these things. I think you all saw the memo from the previous month or two from Steve with all the questions it was asking us, give guidance on, and that was just, a lot to ask of us during our 2-hour meeting, so Lynn and I sat down with staff. But then, so staff kind of was taking notes during that meeting and revised the memo, but to my understanding, they still have some uncertainties or questions or some sort of second thoughts. So maybe I'll just let them take over right now.
Do you want to talk to it, or?
Sure, I think we can probably cover all those bases. I think I'll direct folks to the, let's see, third page of this one that is the update for today's meeting. Has a summary of the proposed changes as were worked through in Friday's work session. And so that has a description of what changed in the text and which, not decisions, it isn't the right word because of course there wasn't a quorum and this isn't final, but sort of choices that were made to alter the text and which direction that this would start to move in. So the language was simplified a bit and trimmed down some, and many of those decision points that were listed in the previous version, which I believe was, it went up to 9 different decision points that were listed out. That is now down to, let's see, 4th page. It's down to only 3 from the original draft and 3 much simpler questions that arose during the working session that seemed to warrant a little bit of discussion. So I included those as well so that the whole board, or commission rather, could get a thought on that.
If I could just jump in and maybe just go through some of them really briefly. One of the discussion points was, is an accessory commercial unit, good for all of the residential neighborhood, or should we just be looking at certain streets and areas? And so the group had decided that it should be allowed everywhere in the residential neighborhood, recommending that not everybody would do this anyway. And so, this would be something that, if we moved forward with it as proposed, is in all of the residential neighborhood zoning. If you'll recall from Brandy's map, there's actually the RN 3600 and the RN 5400, so both of those it would apply to. it would, some of the uses we were trying to work on was, any low intensity kind of use would be appropriate as a permitted accessory commercial unit. And then if it was a more higher intensity use or had some sort of impact, could be traffic, could be odor, something that could be a lot of turnover in the business, that would be a conditional use. But we also recognize that the current conditional use standards are a bit much, and so we need to work on paring down what the review criteria could be. Some of the uses would be, a bar or a food establishment might be more of a conditional use just because they might have more patrons. Galleries or personal services could be permitted. And we hadn't quite worked our way through all of the uses. You heard Tom talk about them earlier. We had agreed a 900 square foot accessory commercial unit was an appropriate size. It could be within an existing building or it could be a new build on the property. In terms of setbacks, it would meet the front setbacks, but you could get a waiver. You could ask for a waiver if it wanted to be closer to the front setback or the front property line. As written, this is showing that it could be 5 feet from the side or rear property line. That's consistent with a small accessory structure like a shed. We allow up to 200 square feet. This is, just something to think about because it is a bit bigger, allowing a 900 square foot accessory kind of structure, 5 feet from the property line.
I will point out, I suppose it didn't even occur to me when we were working through this, but the proposed changes to potentially both RN, both serial numbers of our new RN districts, but at least the 3600 are going to be moving down to 6 foot rear and side setbacks.
Yeah.
So I figure that may well be a moot point. So we could potentially just strike that or, give a free foot of extra space for these things. But I believe we would certainly have to add to that table in the 300 section for specific standards for that accessory structure, is my understanding. And then for the waiver category, we would have to add language relating to that we don't currently have.
And then the group also discussed allowing kind of this outside use of the structure. We had a 20-foot radius, I think, that we settled on from them. So that, if you were a cafe, you could have some seating outside.
That was still, I think, a bit of a loose end to be tied up. The 20 was definitely preferred by the folks at the, by time limit. Over 15, this 15 was seen as maybe too small to be useful, but I've put in point 2 here, the decision points on your last page, that there may well be other ways to go about this that might be less impactful and more useful, hopefully both, but ideally either one or the other, like putting 500 square feet or some other number of square feet of outdoor space for use in the same way between the structure and the street or between the structure and the principal structure on the lot versus just having sort of a donut of space around it. Those were things that were discussed at the working session, so I figured we'd flag that so that folks could maybe think about that.
And then, just really briefly, a couple of things that we are still kind of unresolved, and that personally, I think I'm struggling with is the difference between home business and accessory commercial unit. So I need some more time to kind of think about that. Are both needed? Does this replace home business? So just some thoughts to be given there. And then also, what does the building codes look like if you're adding a commercial does it trigger anything? And that's more just for us to know, so we can provide guidance. But if all of a sudden you're gonna, maybe you know the answer.
No, I just had another question. Did you finish that thought?
Oh, yeah, so the thought is just, we want to be aware, if you're adding a cafe, does it all of a sudden change requirements on your home or something like that? So we need to spend some time looking into that.
I was just gonna ask, I know that in some areas, the home occupation or home-based business has a limitation on the number of people who would be there in a day or during an hour or whatever. And I wonder if that might be one of the designations that would be distinct. So for instance, if somebody had a home-based, if they were a hair cutter and they cut hair in their, in their home, they can't be cutting 4 people's hair at once, right? So it's gonna be like, they have a certain number of clients a day, and the same would be true of a massage therapist or a lawyer or a tax accountant, or, that there's this kind of appointment-based, seems to be a little bit more the home occupancy, whereas this being more of a commercial use, there might be 80 people who go through an art gallery over the course of a day, but maybe it's more concentrated to a particular time period, or, we don't know how many people are gonna stop at a pie shop today, but, they're not making appointments to do so, right? So I think that maybe that's one of the distinctions, is that this is kind of a, retail, commercial, not scheduled, not appointment-based, not people-limited, sort of thing.
It is definitely one of the differences, and so that it is, but do you still need the home business, or do you make that more flexible and call it the accessory commercial? So, yeah.
I think we should point out as well, just for the sake of clarity, that there's no flexibility for a detached home business at the moment in our current standards, whereas this current draft ACU language does allow for that, so that is one major distinction.
Home business can't be detached, is that what you said?
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to interpret what we've got right now to allow for that.
What would be the disadvantage of amending our current home-based business regulations to allow what the ACU regulations are proposing?
That's what I want to figure out. Do we need them both, or do we make the, do we replace the home-based business with the accessory commercial unit? We know, like, it's signage, it is the number of visitors to the site, its hours of operations are limited on home business, which we don't necessarily want to see. So can it be replaced, or is it just better to have this kind of scaling up?
And every use of home business is conditional use, like I think I brought up earlier at the moment. So if the intent is to have some of these be allowing small neighborhood commercial by right, that would need to change too.
Hopefully, commissioners or staff can solve that dilemma. And we can see if we do decide to move forward with ACUs or not, we can see something that resolves.
I'm curious, those of you who were not part of the conversation the 4 of us just had, because we all talked a lot just now, what thoughts do you all have on ACUs right now, based on what you've heard from us and what's written in this memo and the previous memos?
Do we have any public participation?
No.
Oh.
Not tonight.
I was just comparing those from the old land reg that's here on the town.
I wouldn't compare the old reg.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not necessary.
That's why I basically, I was trying to get some clarity on that too, see how that works, so I can get a better answer for that.
I think a couple of questions would be, are you comfortable with it everywhere in the residential neighborhood? Are you
Right.
comfortable with that we came to that decision as opposed to designating certain streets? And this gets to what Brandy was saying at the end of location might matter.
I would like to take more thought on it, me personally.
Well, we're not gonna amend the land use regs
Right.
tonight, so. I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. Sarah, Dan, any thoughts?
Would you like to go, Sarah?
I no sort of extra things to add other than, I'm still very much in favor of ACUs, and yeah, I think the work that's been done already is great. Nothing stands out as, egregious by any means.
Well, so at the end of the memo, the questions raised at the working session, I guess we haven't really addressed those, and I'm sure they can be worked out, but I think number 5 there, as far as requiring owner or resident occupancy of the structure, isn't that implied in this whole thing, that there is a resident occupying the structure in addition, and so there's an accessory commercial use? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think in our conversations on Friday, we got a little off of that, but looking back,
Okay.
that is kind of the.
I don't think inherently, I think we've been potentially presuming that it would be a lot of conceptual, sort of, I feel like it would be a unique concept, maybe in US zoning that I'm familiar with, if we were to do it the opposite way, but at least if we're thinking with dwelling units as the comparable situation, there are quite a few areas, and I think even in state statute here, that will allow for no restriction on resident or owner occupancy of the
Yeah.
ADU, so that could just be another rental unit. So theoretically, I think you could consider doing that with commercial uses, but it might open up a world of situations that we haven't thought of, so.
I mean, it seems at the very least there might be a requirement that if the ACU is not operated and or owned by either the owner or a resident of the property, that they would need, some requirement that they have an agreement, that there's something in writing about how this business is operating, because it seems like that is where it could start to get particularly problematic if somebody's renting out the space and the other residents and or neighbors don't really have anywhere to go because there's, a handshake deal, that there's no agreement, that there's, I don't know. It seems like it could get messy. I generally am not a huge proponent of owner occupancy requirements because it restricts possibility. But this might be a case where it really makes a lot of sense.
For an owner rather than a resident of any kind?
Or maybe resident too, but yeah, I guess it wouldn't necessarily need to be the owner, but if nobody who has claim to the property is involved with the business operations, it seems like it could start to just get messy, somebody's running a.
Well, yeah, well, what I'm getting at is that someone needs to be living there. That seems to be sort of
Gotcha.
someone needs to be living in the building in order for this to be an accessory to it.
Yes.
Right, it's by definition, right? Otherwise, we'd be de facto, whatever you want to call it, you'd be changing the zoning into commercial without changing the zoning, right? It'd become commercial as a whole building. And with 900 square feet, a lot of the houses are that size, so you're within that limit for the whole house, or let's say a whole unit or whatever. Yeah. And if I may, I think to get back to what was discussed about how many people are visiting and those kinds of things, the other complication here might be if it's for commercial building codes, your question 6 at the bottom there, if it were a commercial kitchen, for example, where you have, big dishwashing units and whatever it is, where you need proper cleaning to be followed, I guess that business type, if it were, let's say, a commercial kitchen that's shipping food out or something, that's where you probably do need to put, just a clause in here that, yes, you need to comply with commercial building codes if it's this kind of, business. You can't get around commercial building codes by having a business in a residence of some sort.
And is there a requirement in Brattleboro to have a business license, or is that regulated at the state level?
No, there is a business license required.
So that might be another, of course it's required, but.
Sometimes those kind of things show up in a permit when it's issued as opposed to being in the regs.
So should we try to answer some of these things more concretely?
May I suggest one?
Please.
I don't know if you, did you come up with an answer to whether you should require a bike rack?
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's a yes or no?
We didn't, yeah, it's a yes or no. Start us off.
Well, you know what, I mean, as much of a bike advocate as I am, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the type of business, I would say. And if people are visiting frequently and you have parking, then sure.
So that would be large commercial, small business, barber shop, or are we talking like, say?
I'm just talking about accessory commercials, so they're
I
pretty
mean,
limited.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could just leave it up, you could just leave it up to the DRB, because they're gonna see
Right.
the plan, so
I like
maybe
that
not.
idea of leaving it up to the DRB.
My argument for it was that a couple things. One is that if we're really wanting these to be small scale and very local, then we're expecting people would be walking to it, but people would also potentially be biking to it. So it would
Yeah, sure.
extend, who's willing to go to this place by bike.
Mhm.
It would potentially reduce some of the need for parking and reduce some of the impact of parking, but also that it's a little bit of an indicator
Right.
that, maybe signage isn't huge, but if there's a little staple rack, you're like, oh, there's something happening there, right?
Right.
And it can kind of become a little bit of this is a
Yeah.
little amenity in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the principle for sure. I happen to have I do have a concern based on knowledge of folks who have removed bike racks actually because of either, I don't exactly know, but it was a combination of insurance concerns and, because if they're implying that they're gonna secure your bike, and it gets stolen, all kinds of little things can come up. So I don't think I would really require it, but maybe for some businesses I would, it's a tough one. I totally agree with the principle of it, but there are some small businesses that have removed them for a variety of reasons.
Now,
Gary,
I might have missed that particular meeting. I'm still playing catch up on a lot now. Was ADA also applied with a lot of these commercial buildings, ramps for people to get in and out? That's a
Yeah,
big thing.
that certainly complicates it because residential is,
I think we just have to, staff, didn't you say earlier, you just have to research more and find out if accessory commercial units would legally, by state law, need to comply with the commercial code or not? And so that will be the answer to that
So
question.
that's not really a decision point. I likely should have labeled that differently, but, if that is a federal or a state requirement, we can find out, and then, we have no say in that.
Right.
So that'll just happen.
yeah, right.
But I also wanted to remind everyone, with regards to the parking impact comment, that we did have language in here saying that it would not be required to provide parking space, and in fact is not allowed to provide additional parking space off-street outside of a existing legal driveway for a 1 or 2 unit structure or an existing parking area for a multi-unit structure.
So now, I don't know if we're going the horse before the wagon or the cart before the horse. Is EV also, like you said, mentioning with the DRB, they can make that determination. Some businesses too, having that accessibility with their part. A lot of places that, like Price Chopper.
This wouldn't be in the scale.
So that wouldn't be in that
require an EV
scope.
charger.
And
Okay.
I think it's also worth pointing out that aside from the conditional use aspect, which, as we mentioned earlier, would likely be needing to have or it would be desirable to come up with an alternative similar pathway that was simpler, which I suppose would still go through the DRB. Aside from that, nothing in this would kick the review to the DRB. So this would be, I mean, it's been set up as an accessory structure, and it is not meeting major site plan review or conditional use outside of those situations where, like as in a bar or those other listed uses, would go before the DRB for that. So for things like the bike rack and the EV charger, those elements would not be coming up in major site plan review, because this wouldn't be up for major site plan review.
I have an idea for the uses. On that last page remaining from first draft, number 1. I think, Sue, you spoke to the idea of having low intensity and low risk of nuisance things be permitted, and the flip side being conditional. Sounds good to me. How about you guys take a crack at it? Okay.
And I think this list of potential options, including but not limited to, that seems like a pretty solid list, I think, in terms of suggestions, so that people get the sense of the sorts of things that would be considered within this scope of it.
Right, and as we move farther along, if we see that list, you know, some in the Ps, some in the Cs, permitted and conditional, and we feel like they're missing, then sometimes it's easier to react to a more final draft. That sounds good to everybody. I want to mention in the dimensional standards, did we say anything about side setback? Like if people are seating right up to the property line on the neighboring property? Did we talk about that?
So I believe that that's where the conversation about the difference between sort of this halo of 20 feet around the structure versus rewriting that particular outdoor space usage to allow for a certain number of square feet, but positioning it away from the side lot lines or potentially the rear lot line.
Yeah.
Putting it between the street and the ACU, or between the principal structure and the ACU.
I kind of do like the halo idea, but with modifications that it maybe shouldn't encroach into the side or rear. And maybe...
Unless you don't have a neighbor, and then you might as well take advantage of that space, right?
Yeah, but we don't have any other precedent for that, right? Like we don't allow exemptions for the setbacks if just the neighboring property is, you know, taking a nap or on vacation.
Right, that's true. I do like the idea of having there be a relationship between the front door or the back door of the ACU and the space that it surrounds. I think it would be awkward if the outdoor space was not connected to the accessory structure or accessory commercial unit itself. If you had to go through or past or around other things to get there, it would be strange. So I think the piece about there being some sort of connection between them, which in here is listed as insofar as no point is further than 50 feet from the accessory structure.
We likely don't have the time to discuss the front yard setback aspect. I know that was discussed a bit at the working session. I tentatively removed the more permissive language from the first draft in response to that, but I would love to just hear some discussion on that in general from the commission. What the feelings are about allowing for ACUs to be up closer to the street. I mean, that's almost universally how these programs have been stood up elsewhere. So I do think it's worth considering what limitations to the potential of these might come from pushing them back to at the facade line of the home or putting it behind the home. And I do also appreciate that the front yard setback uniformity is considered to be quite an important aspect of character to a lot of folks. So I understand that sensitivity is also worth balancing. But I'd love to hear some discussion at some point, or
My
maybe
first thought
it's
is the, making the front setback apply, but allow encroachment or allow advancing into it with the condition, the ERB review, without waiver, I mean. You know, if a compelling reason gets described or presented to the DRB, then maybe they'll see it, but we shouldn't just grant it to any ACU that wants it. Unless they all have compelling reasons. That's my first thought.
Yeah, I'm definitely on board with that. I think the fear is you open an ACU and then it closes and then it gets
Right.
converted to the residential, and so I feel like it's just a push on the setbacks that is not necessary.
Maybe it would be worth looking into legal research a bit for what language we could have to prevent that sort of cup game from going on.
What other questions do you all have as staff before doing another update, or do you? I feel like we're getting closer. But is there anything?
Yeah, I
anybody-
think this is good.
So it seemed like on the first one, there was general consensus that just seeing staff bring a use chart based on the discussion that was had here and on the 30th, to sort of up down at that point would be less onerous. So I think we can certainly do that. It seemed like there was not yet consensus on number 2 here, but the flexibility of both of these things was appreciated, so maybe something that synthesizes that to allow for unique conditions. And then, I recognize now that number 3 was what I was just bringing up. So it seems like that might not have a lot of strong consensus on how to deal with it. So maybe some background, further research, and figuring out how to tighten up that language, giving 2 proposals or alternatives.
Well, on that one, it sounds to me like there's already the potential for a waiver from the DRB to encroach into a front setback. That's already allowed.
It's one of the
As
proposals.
proposed, yeah.
Okay, so that's not allowed just in general. That's
Yeah.
one of the things we're suggesting be a possibility for these units in particular.
It's actually it's one of the amendments that we've talked about offline from Brandy's work that
I
would
see.
actually allow it.
Currently, there's no flexibility. In the previous memo, there was the allowance for a particular special accessory use front setback for these of 3 feet, which was just arbitrarily picking the, well, not arbitrary, picking the most similar existing accessory use or structure, rather.
So if
which
we
was
left,
like porches.
if we left that out from this at this point, it could still potentially happen, and then it would apply to everything, not just ACUs.
Yes.
Okay,
If it gets adopted.
if it gets adopted. If not, this would be the only thing that has that pathway. Okay.
And in the event that it does get adopted, perhaps there could be a, return to that language to see if there's an interest in having the ACUs have a little bit more flexibility given their nature. If you can get up up to a certain distance for residential primary uses, but you could get 5 feet away, per se. I think we could certainly tweak the language in the event that there's a major change.
I guess the other thing that I still am working to wrap my brain around a little bit is the differences between home-based business, home occupancy, and accessory commercial unit, and whether there's a way to simplify by not having 3 things. And I don't know how to go about figuring that out. Maybe I just need to spend more time with the code book, but.
That's what I'm looking up now.
There's a bit of discussion on that very point in the August memo that this was spawned out of. I'm not sure if I should sign off on it being particularly accurate because it's been a while. So I'll revisit that and see if I should recommend returning to that. But definitely a well-taken point. We've been sort of.
I mean, I'm just curious whether, if it wouldn't be much to change home-based business to accommodate the sorts of uses we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And maybe we change what we already have rather than adding a new category, which could add some potential confusion and a requirement to update in multiple places.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
want to spend a little time on in the next 2 weeks. And maybe the accessory commercial is a better name than home-based
Sure.
business too.
Right,
Yeah.
right, maybe we update it in that way.
I don't know, had you gotten the new land rates?
No, we're gonna make all these
No.
amendments and you're all gonna get them.
We're all gonna get a copy.
I
was in hiatus
Bedtime
for-
reading.
It's online. Made you a copy.
Yeah, I was kind of out of.
I got old ones,
Coming back.
2015.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think I have.
There's
one.
been some minor amendments in there.
We sent
Yeah,
out,
sure.
we
Yeah.
sent out printed out
Yeah.
inserts for
Yeah.
the things that did change, but it's probably like 2 to 5% of it.
Yeah.
Got edited.
I think I have the other one, I have to bring that back.
Just want to alert you to the time.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we kind of answered some things, we kind of didn't, and some of them are dependent upon what happens with the home business, ACU, conflagration, that's not the right word.
And the piece about what the impacts might be or implications might be with commercial code and commercial building, 'cause
Right.
that might have some pretty serious implications for this proposal.
I think I've got a good sense of what we need to bring back and be able to address.
Did we go around a little bit more though and say what our thoughts are about requiring owner or resident occupancy of the structure? I mean, I feel like I could swing either way on this, but my thinking is not to require that. I mean, it's owned by the owner and they have control. And just like they can rent to residential space to people, I feel like it would seem to make sense they can rent this to whomever wants to run the business, but, you know, it's much limited compared to a principal commercial.
That would certainly
That's just
be a
my thinking.
distinction with the home business.
Yeah, and I think as somebody who's had a base business in Brattleboro in 3 different locations over the last couple of decades, I gotta say, I think you're opening a little bit of a potential firestorm with that. I think that I think it needs to be required that the owner is living there, or it loses all relevance as a condition. And I think to talk about
Owner has to live there, you're saying, but doesn't have to own the business. You're saying they should own the business as well.
Oh, I think so. I think that it could, at least validity is a real control if the owner doesn't both, live there and own the business. But I think I'd be willing to think about it for sure.
Yeah.
And then it could be interesting if we did, the business must be operated either by the property owner or a resident. As opposed to, maybe the owner does actually live on the property, but they don't run the business.
Yeah.
Or
I just see
machine.
them buying essentially, like a big business, buying essentially lots of little places, saying, and you get to live there. And I could just see lots of potential abuse, but,
Interesting.
yeah.
I guess we're undecided on that.
Yeah.
For now. I don't know, I think that's all we're gonna do.
To be
Oh, yeah.
continued.
Yeah,
You continue.
and the energy thing too. Okay, so the necessary public comment period begins now, no public, it ends now. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I motion that we adjourn.
I'll second that.
In a second. Great, we're adjourned.
We can-
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Sue.